and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I talk more about the kind of what the belief questions and answers that madness provokes. I'm continuing the conversation here about beliefs. And of course, in the sort of earlier videos in sort of 4.1, how beliefs form, I kind of showed you just sort of how complex actually, the kind of layers of beliefs that we create are. I showed that we can look at it from a process point of view. I showed that actually, beliefs are ideas that we internalize, to act on in spaces where we lack good evidence or coherent evidence. So what happens, of course, is that we actually make a choice so that we can act on it. So in effect, we accept some evidence, we dismiss the stuff that doesn't fit the belief that we actually like. And here you might actually call it more, something like what we believe in and therefore want to act on to make come true. And of course, what happens in that situation is that actually, as we act on those ideas, we accumulate more evidence. And of course, our confirmation bias works to either confirm them or of course, sometimes to dismiss them. Because what I also showed is that a characteristic of mad beliefs is that what happens is we get this sort of combination of belief and doubt. And that actually what happens is that the belief is the piece that we hold strongly. And that's actually because we actually have evidence that comes directly from the phenomenology. And of course, that's evidence that I have, other people don't. But it's very, very difficult, of course, for me to refute that evidence. A, because the phenomenology persists, and B, because of course I am in this space where it's very difficult to prove anything or disprove anything. So I have that piece of evidence, struggle to dismiss it because the phenomenology is persistent. And of course, what happens with that is I'm forced to at least acknowledge that, that information coming from the phenomenology. And because I'm experiencing it under conditions of risk and stress, of course, I'm actually projecting that forwards and assessing the implications. And of course, I see the risk, of course, in the implications. And of course, that's the piece that creates all the doubt. It's the doubt is in what does this mean for me? I have this evidence. I heard, so for example, with me, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing. I was home alone in my apartment. I reached the interpretation that it could only be my neighbors because that was the only place from which people could see into my apartment was from the fire escape. The only people with access was my upstairs neighbors, therefore it had to be them. So it was a very logical conclusion to say that the voices that I heard were my upstairs neighbors. Of course, when that persisted and I heard them the next day and the next day, and then of course what neighbors said became more and more intrusive. Of course, it was the implications of that that became the problem, and that was the doubt that actually led to me literally, moving and and of course changing apartments. So what I want to do here is actually just think about a couple of different ways of actually simplifying, how we how we look at beliefs. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to look at it from the point of view of our emotional systems and actually show you how beliefs evolve in different layers. That actually the phenomenology is actually introducing information in a sort of context that generally creates sort of conflict. As voices persist, you're getting new information, which is building a sort of a picture, sort of as you move. And of course, that is actually, engaging our emotional systems. And of course, our emotional systems lead us in particular directions of interpretation and implication. And it's important to recognize here that I'm bringing these two together because really the experience of it, the stuff that creates the paranoia and fear is that I actually, believe that this voice that I'm hearing, is being imposed by voice-to-skull technology, by the CIA, for example, and of course that then gives power to my assessment of the implications. And of course, implications are things that change much, much faster than the interpretation. So one interpretation has many implications at any point in time. So of course, as voices keep peppering me with ideas, it's really the implications that are important because that's what's creating the emotions. And I say you see it particularly with fear and paranoia. So what I want to do is show you, how our beliefs sort of evolve in layers. And so this is not a static thing. So I find that the voices that I hear are actually particularly proactive and leading me in a particular direction. And I want to kind of show you actually how that works. And then what I want to do is show you how we can actually develop a matrix, which actually is just a way to give us a model, a framework for actually thinking about our beliefs differently. Because one of the big problems with the beliefs that we form is that we don't even realize often that we have formed them. So for example, let's say when I first started to hear voices, I was absolutely convinced that I heard the sound of two people talking to me, and therefore it was my neighbors. The fact that other people who came and visited couldn't hear them simply meant that my neighbors were not speaking while they were there. And of course, as you've seen in the experience videos, it traps you in this kind of catch-22 situation where it's very, very difficult for you to actually address it and check the evidence and actually do anything about it. So what I'm going to do, and then of course, I also showed you in the sort of first of the belief videos how once voices started to follow me outside, or I started to hear them in other rooms and then outside my apartment while my voices were saying, "We're following you, spying on you." Of course, that then sort of created this experience of voices having this vantage point from which they could comment on my life. And of course, they escalated that idea of being able to comment on what I was doing and knowing what I was doing wherever I was, spying on me. They sort of then escalated that, or tried to escalate that, to kind of saying they actually had influence over what was happening in my life. And I showed you how that easily escalates to the idea of voices having omnipotence. So especially if they're claiming to be God and the devil. I showed you in the second video on beliefs, how they can actually escalate that. Because once that happens, it's way more sort of complicated. So what I want to do is kind of map you in sort of two examples that are time related. It happens to relate to two different formats of phenomenology. So I'll talk about sort of early on, when I heard the sound of what I thought was two people talking about what I was doing, as one example for mapping. It's a nice simple one. And then I'll show you how the sort of complex one, for how when voices create this vantage point and comment on your life, it adds a layer of complexity, but actually you can still use the same framework to identify what's going on. So first of all, I want to talk about sort of belief layering. And of course, there's a sequence element to this. And I'm going to talk a little bit more here actually about two things. I'll show you how there's sort of two ways to think about how we can simplify spotting them, and of course, understanding them, and then of course understanding what that means in our life. And I'm going to look at our emotional systems as one, because actually, our emotional systems, our sort of confidence is a measure of our, in our mind, really, of our trust in the world around us. And of course, you can see how it's undermining our emotional systems. That's one aspect. And of course, the other is, how we assess the implications, which is when we project, our ideas forward, into the world that we live in. And I'll show you just, sort of how, even the sort of complex system of beliefs that we form can be simplified by, sort of thinking about, those two models. So the last slide from sort of my beliefs part 1 video, in which I showed how beliefs are formed, I actually summarized with this simplification. Really, I called it there. But what I'm really getting at, what I'm bringing it back to here is kind of saying, remember that our mind processing is predictive. So a stimulus leads us to a reaction, a response, in the form of interpretation, implications, and then the stuff we internalize. One of the things we internalize, of course, is beliefs, and we project that in terms of how we express that in life. And like I said, that actually the way that we could simplify it was to kind of say that there are these three sort of groups of themes that actually shape our beliefs. The first is the phenomenology, so the weird stimuli, the information that is introduced, which arrives in a particular way. So this is what I've called the sort of mode beforehand. It has a style to it, which is what I'm calling the sort of body language. And then of course there's what voices say, which is the sort of the content of it. And we can actually think of how we interpret this or even internalize some of this as ideas that I have formed myself. So I've asked these questions: what is this? Why is this happening? And I've reached an interpretation. So in the beginning, I heard the sound of two people talking about what I was doing. I interpreted that very logically and reached the conclusion that it had to be my upstairs neighbors. Later on, voices started to assert what they were, and they claimed to be people who had died, ancestors, in particular ancestors of mine, making it more personal, and then of course God, the devil, blah blah blah. So this is what voices actually claimed to be. So it's based on what they said. Of course, sometimes they did this a bit more subtly, so by suggestion. And then of course, what happens is, because in the space of beliefs, we actually lack evidence. Of course, one of the things that we do is we ask other people around us what they think. So of course, we sort of actively seek out, in this case, not just ideas from other people, but help. Because this is pretty stressful. And of course, what happens is, we get ideas from other people. And I say, unfortunately, in this situation, it's typically the ideas of those around you, or the beliefs of those around you, that get forced on you. And then I said, of course, because, this predictive processing is something that widens, of course, one stimulus, in a particular context can lead to a particular interpretation. And of course, in a different context, it might be a different interpretation. And then, of course, each interpretation has many, many implications depending on the context. So we get this kind of shotgun effect. By the time we're looking at the implications, which is the stuff that's causing all the stress, we have such a sort of long list of things that we're sort of talking about. We've lost sight of what the little stimulus was that actually led to that sort of whole range of implications and interpretations. And I said, whilst the implications is a little bit more difficult sometimes to assess, what we can do is thematically group our interpretations to radically simplify them. And we can actually notice, if we do that, that the interpretations that we reach typically relate to me and my world, or me and how I relate to my world. So I might kind of say that it's my brain, or something that happened to me in the past, or it's our shared world, which we might see as uncaring, and therefore this is a reasonable response. Or when that's an interpreted one. And of course, when voices are being much, much more proactive and engaging you in stories of conspiracy, this is something, of course, that voices have asserted. And then, of course, there's the third category, which is this otherworldly category. So because voices create this vantage point from which they're kind of looking in on my world and our world, and of course they then claim to be God and the devil and an evil God and aliens and multiples and all these other things. Of course, we get all these sort of otherworldly interpretations of them. And then, of course, as I like to put in here, I kind of say that actually, remember, another option is to say that actually we don't know, which we don't. And of course, that actually we can reject all of those things. And that the reason you want to do that is because what you're doing is you're cutting down all those implications, which are the experience of it. And as I said, what matters is that this is the flow. So this is the stimulus. So this is my reaction and my response. I'm interpreting it in a particular way. And then, of course, our interpretations flow into, as I say, implications for me in the world. And of course, this is actually what it means for how I live my life. And of course, what matters for quality of life is that actually, from an emotional systems point of view, what we want to do is build confidence in ourselves and confidence in the world that we live in. And of course, what we want to do is have control of what we give significance to in our story, because of course, the life I live is the story that I create, or the story that I create is the life that I live. Take your pick. I think they sort of go together. So remember that, of course, what's happening is, the weird stimuli are introducing information in an unusual way, leads to a reaction response that leads to interpretation and assessment of implications. And of course, all of that stuff affects my experience of hearing voices. And of course, it affects my quality of life. So what I internalize and act on, of course, is the important, is a very, very important piece. And that's just, in this case, a belief, because in fact, we have very, very few facts, about this phenomenon and what it actually means for us. And of course, that's the point. That's why we're also different in terms of our interpretations and our assessment of implications. But we can understand it simply in terms of our mind processing, which I've spoken about before. And of course, what's happening here is that actually this is engaging our emotional systems. Our emotional systems lead our thinking in a particular way. So if I feel threatened, by voices or what they're saying, so by the way they've inserted this information, which can often in itself be scary. So my voices are bullying and aggressive. So in that sense, they're threatening. And of course, in their style, in their tempo, when they talk, when they interact with me, all that stuff is actually aggressive and bullying. And then, of course, what they say is actually all designed to establish a position of power and abuse over me. So, of course, what that's doing is it's engaging my monitoring and my threat system often. And what it's doing is it's giving me a perception, that this thing is threatening. And of course, when they talk about my world and what's going to happen in it and their influence over it, and they won't let this happen and they will make that happen, of course, then what they're doing is they're changing my concept of the world and certainly my perception of what they can do, and of course, what I can do. And of course, that then, of course, to say is my emotional systems are in threat mode. And of course, that shapes the kinds of beliefs I'm actually likely to form. And of course, what my soothe system is trying to achieve is good outcomes and experiences. What my monitoring system is trying to achieve is a sense of security. And of course, what my drive system is trying to achieve is a sense that I can actually act in the world that I live in to create the kinds of outcomes and experiences that I want. And of course, this is the piece, of course, that voices are interfering with. So as the information flows, as voices are throwing stuff at us, this is what's being undermined. So my sense of confidence is being undermined because I perceive voices as threatening and as bullying. So that's my sort of environment check, if you like. That's because my body's reacting to it. I sense that actually voices are getting in the way of the outcomes that I'm trying to achieve. They're trying to force unpleasant outcomes on me and outcomes that I don't want, that are not my preference. And of course, they're undermining my ability to act. So of course, when I'm assessing the implications of that, which I'm doing with kind of my story, is I'm liable to make my world smaller. This is actually the problem. This is when I say we actually tend to form limiting beliefs. And of course, what happens is voices make you feel less than, and they assert themselves to be more powerful, and they exaggerate that power gap, if you like, between themselves and the voice hero. So what I want to show you is I've showed you my story model before, where I'm simply saying what I'm doing is connecting the stuff that comes from our body stem with my straight line. So this is our senses, our activity, which is this is the body stuff, and body and the world that I live in. This is where I'm acting, which is the source of the majority of my stimuli. Other stimuli come from my mind, and of course I'm interpreting them in big picture in my story across these kind of 5 themes. So there's me and my concept of myself and my confidence in myself, which of course I showed you is undermined by this process. And of course, this is the sort of point of confidence, is how I understand myself and what I can do, and who I'm going to do it with. So this is how I sort of move into my world, which is, the people I associate with, what I do in my day, which is represented down here, and of course, what that means for my future. So that's what I'm calling my world. So this is me and my world. I'm just showing you how my themes, my thematic groupings of how we interpret stuff is also represented in the my story model. And of course, what happened, so for example, with when I first heard voices, I heard the sound of 2 people talking about what I was doing. It kind of sits more or less there. Voices were, these were people that were not a close relationship, but they were my neighbors. I knew they were there. I bumped into them on the stairs. They were talking about what I was doing. And of course, what I was doing was stuff kind of in, sort of in my day. So this was, I interpreted this as something going on about, what was happening in my world. And then, of course, when I went to see the doctor and he described it as auditory hallucinations, that tracked back to here, knowing what my brain, perhaps misfiring. And of course, this, of course, translates into the world. So when the voices I heard started to follow me outside my apartment, and make all sorts of comments about what I was doing and how, what I was doing was a threat to them and to me, and how they would interfere. And of course, all of these things, my frame of reference in which, voices would be very, very busy, of course, became, the world. And of course, because that's where voices were very, very active. Of course, my interpretation now is likely to be, about something about the role of voices in the world. This is when they started to introduce the idea, of course, of conspiracy. And of course, because I was having these sort of weird effects, it was sort of, and of course, voices commenting on what I was doing. So, going to an internet cafe and I was logging in, say, to my email account, and voices were kind of saying, well, why are you doing this here? We can track you from, just your login to your email account, no matter where you are, whether you're in an internet cafe or doing it from your own PC. Of course, because I, at that stage, was sort of worried about that my PC had been hacked. So, of course, as I went, which was my world, and of course, as I went to the internet cafe in the world, of course, voices just transferred what they were busy with into that space, and of course, started to undermine my confidence in the world. And of course, then they introduced the idea of conspiracy and the CIA and blah, 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 all of those things. And then, as you saw, of course, they later on, of course, then introduced the idea of ancestors of mine, God, minions, the devil, an evil God, and aliens. So these are all these sort of otherworldly interpretations. But of course, the big effect of the implications for that for me is it started to change my concept of the world. And of course, it's from this vantage point, which of course was all seeing. Voices could, were following me around and commenting on what I was doing wherever I went. And of course, in these roles of God and the devil, of course, in particular, they claimed all sorts of influence and omnipotence. And of course, what that's doing is, as I say, is changing literally everything. So of course, voices then engaged me in the idea that I am the second coming, of course, which had an impact on my concept of self. Initially, I rejected it all. And of course, later on, when voices just kept insisting and persisting rather, in spite of my rejecting it, I kind of said, okay, well, I'll play the role of, which of course just led to a whole lot of wasted effort. Some of that was quite manic, and a bit of, but the effect of that was a lot of wasted effort. I kind of solved all sorts of problems, some of which might still become real solutions to real problems, but a lot of it was just a total waste, of time. So, I mean, had I believed I was the second coming and, of course, started to tell people around me that I am the second coming, what they would have done would have just, damaged my credibility, of course, with people around me. They would have become much, much more concerned. They would, of course, would have done a lot more to encourage me, to, of course, go and see psychiatrists or go into institutions and all of those kinds of things, because, of course, we perceive that as, an unrealistic and delusional belief. So, what I'm wanting to do here is kind of say that, remember, we've got a process that leads us towards interpretations. And once we're kind of in the space of, let's say, me, my world, the world, other world, voices will be active in particular themes, in particular sort of frames of reference. And of course, what's happening, is that, of course, voices are trying to assert this influence. And of course, with me, the way this worked, and I think, many will actually find it kind of quite similar, is voices sort of started commenting on my day, and it could have been, it was really incidental stuff that I was doing in the apartment. I was making something to eat. I mean, it was, really incidental stuff, kind of when it started. The sound of a male voice and a female voice. There was a couple living upstairs. So, it was, to me, a very deliberate process of leading me along to that belief, which, seemed reasonable on day one, unreasonable by day 5. It was really, a threat to my privacy, of course, at home. And of course, what happened with me is that, it started with something related to my activity, so that I would actually reach a logical conclusion about what this thing was. And then, of course, as it evolved, I sought help from people around me. I got friends come over. I spoke to the landlady, and of course, as I mentioned in my first episode videos, and just started to put a little grain of sand into those relationships. I was very lucky that my relationships are strong and survived that without any problem. but it's not unusual for people's relationships to be contaminated, because of course what happens is voices then start to say, so-and-so will think and so-and-so will do. And of course, a lot of our relationship with people is based on our perception of what they think of us. And of course, if that's what voices are talking about, it'll change our perception of a relationship very, very easily. And so we see that in lots of people losing their close relationships, because those are the people we turn to first for help. So those relationships take the brunt, of this distortion of our perceptions. So I'm simply saying voices moved this way with me first. It started commenting on what I was doing. Of course, I started to ask other people, which is, I put this grain of sand in. I went to see the doctor as opposed to a psychiatrist. I saw the doctor first. And of course, he described it as auditory hallucinations. And of course, now, when I assess the implications of that, the first thing I kind of say is actually, okay, it's not something that's going on in my world. It's not my neighbors misbehaving. It's actually something going on with my brain. And of course, that brings me back here, which undermines my confidence in myself, undermines my confidence in my senses, because I now actually can't rely on the inputs that I'm getting. Of course, I don't really know how to project that into my future, but there's no doubt that it undermines my confidence, which means I'm going to do less, in my world. And of course, it sort of underestimates then what I'm capable of, if you like, in our world. And then, of course, having undermined me, so that I thought less of myself, or certainly had doubts about it, certainly lacked confidence. I can't say I thought less of myself. I lacked confidence in my case. I think both of those can actually happen. Of course, voices then moved the other way, and then, of course, then started to introduce this other world as initially ancestors, say then ancestors of mine, which they then used, they introduced as, people that I had known that had a role in why voices were engaging me. And of course, they then proceeded to interfere in my day, in our future, in my relationships, across this whole kind of spectrum. But I simply, and of course, what they did, of course, was change my concept of the world. And of course, that relationship between my perception and, of course, my concept of the world is, of course, as I say, at the big picture, my sort of my consciousness. But in the sort of moment by moment, of course, it's shaping my perception, because, of course, everything I do, every perception that I create, is a comparison of two states of information and emotion, and of course, they're affecting both of those, in some way. But say with me, it was very clear that what voices did was they started commenting about my day, something that I would just interpret in my real world context, so that it became relevant in my world. It then sort of tracked back to undermining me, or my confidence in myself. And then, of course, voices exaggerated their power by creating this vantage point from which they claimed to be omnipotent and having this, this influence on my world. So I was now less than, they were now greater than. And of course, that established this relationship of power from which they made threats and, of course, promises. And of course, you can imagine what that did to my emotional systems, to my sense of security, to my sense that I could create the kind of outcomes and experiences that I wanted, and of course that I was used to doing. And of course, because this is now something in an otherworldly realm, and even down here, something that I couldn't do anything about. Of course, it undermined my sense of agency, and of course, my ability to act. And of course, by exaggerating this power difference, of course, they intensified the experience of it dramatically. And of course, that's of course what led to paranoia and panic attacks. So of course, from before, what I've mentioned is that actually, whilst we can work with these things, what we want to do is we want to move it as close to the source as possible. And of course, the source is where the new information is, of course, coming in, which of course is actually the phenomenology. So again, just to give you here now, so you've seen the evolution from stimuli through the process to how we interpret that in the my story model, and that actually our voices very deliberately moved up and down the 5 themes of my story to undermine me and exaggerate their power. I'm going to show you the same thing different visual of it and kind of focus on, what they did, of course, for the emotional systems. So on the previous page, I'm showing you, what they had to do for each frame of reference in which I was interpreting what was happening. But of course, as I've shown you before, is one of the other things that happens is, of course, voices have now established this, this relationship of power over me, or an abusive one in my case. And of course, as that persists, of course, my emotional systems struggle, of course, to achieve it. So at first, to say, I was a bit frustrated, if you like, by hearing the sound of two people talking about what I was doing, which I interpreted as my neighbors. Once I started to hear voices outside the apartment, and of course, my voices made a big show of bringing my attention to how they sort of gradually moved, to other rooms in my apartment, then I say to the hallway, then down the stairs, and then into the street. So that was making me very aware of the shift in where I experienced, the sound of people talking about what I was doing. And of course, when it was out in the street, it could no longer be my neighbors. And of course, I didn't know what it was. But of course, just this belief that I don't know and can't figure it out, of course, is what is creating, high emotions of threat. And of course, voices are now claiming to have this all-seeing vantage point and creating this impression of spying on you. We can follow you wherever you go. It doesn't matter where you work on your PC. We can actually trace you. Of course, that's they were saying, of course, electronically. And of course, that is what's creating the conflict and is engaging my emotional systems, in unpleasant ways that I'm kind of saying I can't achieve a good outcome. I perceive it as a threat, at the very least as unpleasant because it's bullying. Well, I mean, the good voices are actually making threats at this stage, so express it as threatening. I can't walk away from it, and actually I feel like I can't fight. So my drive system isn't actually achieving its sense of agency either. And then, of course, voices then proceeded to use this position to create news stories. And of course, they created characters that were on my side, if you were, the I love yous, or people that I would identify with. So my grandmother, my niece that had passed on, others that I knew that had passed on. And then, of course, they inserted themselves by asserting that they were, that one of them anyway was God, and then, of course, later the devil, and then later an evil God. And of course, this is just visually, this relationship of exaggerated power. When you've got the devil inserting information in your mind, this little frown doesn't quite represent how you feel. And of course, this is the team, of course, now that is telling you what to do, and of course, and what not to do. And of course, they are acting as a team. And of course, all of them were just, of course, getting in the way. So, of course, the unknown was a threat, of course, to my monitor system because I didn't know what to expect. So my monitor system couldn't create expectations and was always on the lookout. I became hypervigilant. Of course, God got in the way of creating the kind of outcomes that I want or choosing the life that I want. I was suddenly now the second coming and I had a job to do, which is not a job that I chose. And of course, it would be the same for a shaman, for example, in some sort of culture. And then, of course, God introduced his best buddy by becoming his best buddy, the devil. And of course, the devil was, out there to get in the way of me being able to do anything because he, although I was calling him she at this stage, was just determined to get in the way. This is the one that became Tutu. This is the one that became Squealy. And of course, then the other one was just the one that became, was still attacking my monitoring system by just being irritating, is the one that became Poopsie, as you see in the experience videos. But of course, what's happening now is my emotional systems are not achieving, what I'm used to them achieving, which is instead of a sense of security, I'm now scared. Instead of being able to achieve the outcomes that I want, I've got this thing that's just confusing my life and getting in the way of outcomes that I want to achieve. And of course, this fellow over here that's making it very, very complicated to achieve what I want to do by throwing all this stuff at me, all this nonsense, all this misdirection, deceit, interference, intervening, all this kind of stuff. That's actually, of course, my emotional systems are not achieving what I was able to achieve with them beforehand. So I say, instead of a sense of security and being able to achieve the outcomes I want, do the stuff of my sort of preference and get there easily, I've now got this kind of picture. With this phenomenon, having created this relationship from an all-seeing vantage point, a position of power. And of course, what they did was, introduce, not just people in the real world that were, either allies or enemies, but of course, people in this other world that were sort of allies and enemies. And of course, that was how they just proceeded to interfere with my life, working way over here at the sort of our future end of the scale, which is the top, if you like, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And of course, as I say, because they struggled, of course, to undermine my sense of self, they certainly undermined my confidence of how I expressed myself in the world, but certainly I still was pretty strong about understanding kind of who I was. They worked much, much more over here. And of course, what they did was just create this huge amount of complexity and confusing and therefore distraction, which of course they quite often were able to make scary. So then just to point out the layers in this. So I'm going to do this from the emotional systems point of view. So of course, what happened in the beginning, when it was my neighbors, the phenomenology, this deliberate introduction of male, female voice commenting on what I was doing that led to this belief, that of course I had the information for, others didn't, with my monitoring system picking this up and kind of saying, what do I do about this? Don't really like it. And of course, that sort of what do I do about this is the problem that voices created. It was actually a fake problem. This wasn't my neighbors. I believed it was. And of course, that escalated, of course, as escalated my emotions, of course, and my sense of being unable to do anything about it, as voices moved where I could hear them into other rooms. And of course, then outside my apartment and then in the hotel that I went to, when I was trying to sort of escape them, they were kind of showing me that actually, no matter what I did, I couldn't get away from them. Of course, this was undermining my drive system. And of course, what happened is at the end of those sort of 7 or 8 weeks, I now had this relationship that was established. Voices and I were interacting in this two-way conversation where every new piece of information moved the relationship along. So they created this abusive relationship, with presence controlled by them, invasiveness controlled by them. And of course, they were doing that to insert conflict all the time. In terms of what I was trying to do, which of course was undermining my soothe system. So that's another way to kind of think about it, how to simplify them, is kind of show how they're actually undermining our emotional systems. And of course, what our emotional systems are doing is trying to, equilibrium is when we have a sense of confidence in the physical world. So that's our monitoring system and the safe spaces we have created. In being able to achieve the outcomes that we want. So that's kind of opportunity related. And when I say being able to achieve, so being able to act on things to achieve those outcomes, that's our drive system. So you can see how all three were undermined. Because what this did was create emotional instability, the scared and confused and sort of unsure that arise from the scary, confusing and complicated. And of course, what happens then is I'm more likely to rely on others, to ask for their help. Of course, this undermined, it was likely to lead to sort of undermining my relationships and of course my confidence in the world. But voices have set up this position of power where they made themselves greater than, made me less than, sort of diminished me. And then of course, they just applied these stories or engaged me in these stories, which you see in the experience videos, which is just the mode, if you like, or the context rather in which they kind of asserted power and they introduced all these other relationships or commented on my relationships. So these were the other relationships. And then of course, not only those, so with the CIA in this conspiracy thing, of course, and then of course tried to undermine my relationships with the people that I know and love and work with and associate with, by constantly saying so-and-so will think this, so-and-so will do that, so-and-so won't do this, so-and-so won't be available, all of those kinds of things. So of course, these new characters come along with intent, which is undermining the drive system because you never know what they're going to do or what their intent is or how it might unfold. And of course, they're claiming it under this kind of banner of power and influence and omnipotence. So that, of course, that omnipotence is designed to overpower my sense of agency. They're kind of saying that actually they decide regardless of what I do. That's how they're actually doing that. And then, of course, at the same time, the way we're experiencing this thing is it's confusing our perception. So, not only am I seeing things that I shouldn't see, I'm hearing things that I shouldn't be hearing. I'm literally feeling pinpricks and all these things that go along with the story. So, you know, my trust in my senses is also sort of undermined. But not only that, because I don't know what to believe, you know, I'm scared, you know, I'm cautious, I'm certainly nervous about some of my interactions, you know, in the world and other people. Of course, you know, my signal strengths are being confused. My cognitive bias and confirmation bias are working against me here, of course, rather than for me. So I'm hoping that, you know, that would be one way to help people kind of see that actually, you know, it all comes from the phenomenology, and particularly if you have voices commenting on what you're doing from the sort of vantage point, you can see, you know, how that very easily undermines your emotional systems, which are trying to achieve this equilibrium with a sense of confidence in my environment and in the safe spaces I've created, you know, agency, so my ability to act in the world to achieve the outcomes that I want. And of course, instead of that, we're feeling scared, confused, and, you know, that life is complicated. And hopefully that's enough to help a lot of people kind of move on and actually say there's no point in actually giving significance to these things because they're getting in the way of our lives. So another way to map them, and I've got two pictures here. No, two pictures here, rather, sorry. And I'm just going to do two different types of phenomenology. And all I'm going to do is kind of say that actually, you know, there are about 8 or 9 different sort of forms of phenomenology that I think this is worth doing for. I'm simply going to choose 2 which are common because I think, you know, these are the sort of obvious ones, a simple one. And then, you know, which is actually just the sound of 2 voices talking about what I'm doing. And then the second one I'll do is the actual interaction. So voices say something and my thoughts are shared in the same bandwidth so that we're actually interacting. And as you saw in the video on beliefs part 1, I kind of said actually what happens is we're provoked into asking these questions. And of course, what we do first of all is we ask, what is this? And what that does in our mind is it creates an object that we label in some way or another. And then of course, what happens is we populate, you know, we keep updating our understanding of this object, which then of course affects all of our other object relationships in our life. And of course, you know, so what I'm saying is we can actually think of the phenomenology, because a lot of the beliefs are shaped specifically quite specifically by the phenomenology. And of course, what we then need to do is look at the other side of the equation, is how I project that into my world, which is how I assess the implications. So much as I did, you know, on the sort of on the first slide, I'm simply saying we can break this down a little bit more detail if we want to, and we can say that actually, you know, the phenomenology provokes questions in particular ways. So this is the first one I mentioned I'm going to talk about. So 2 voices talking to each other that I can hear. You know, they might be about anything, or it might be about me, which just makes it a bit more sort of personal. And of course, what this does is it provokes me to ask certain particular questions. And as I showed in the belief video part 1, actually our questions are variations on the 5 basic questions: who, what, where, why, how, when. And I want to just show you how that actually evolves into a simple in a simple belief. So for the moment, I'm going to put where and when aside because they are usually self-evident, although I show in the first episode videos that it was actually very relevant in shaping my understanding of the intent of voices. So what it's doing, as I say here, is the relevance is how it actually shapes what we expect or anticipate, because I'm understanding the intent, and of course I'm doing that in order to anticipate it, you know, or to shape an expectation, which is, you know, at the front end of my mind processing. So of course what I'm doing is I'm asking the first question, well, what is this, or who is this? So, and of course I'm going to attribute this new stimulus to this frame of reference, you know, or object that I call, you know, what or who. So I say, you know, what is this, or who is it that I can hear? And then I sort of ask the question, well, how is this happening? So I've now got an object. It's unusual. It's, you know, I'm hearing it, you aren't. So of course, the next logical question is I'm trying to explain this. So kind of how is this happening? So this is still related, of course, to the phenomenology because I'm using the attributes of this phenomenon that I'm experiencing. That's different. I'm saying, well, what is this? And of course, I'm forming such it. So after I was told, by the doctor that this was auditory hallucinations, for example, I could, to associate with it that it wasn't neighbors. And then I said, well, how is this happening? And of course, in my case, I couldn't relate the very logical thing to say it's happening. And of course, and then we'll start to say why, which is the kind of reasoning. And then, of course, you then kind of say, well, what does this mean for me? And those are the very basic questions that we're asking. We're simply saying, well, what is it? We form a picture of that. We then say, okay, how is this happening? Why is it happening? Why is it happening to me? And of course, what does that mean for me? Because of course, this is actually changing our perception of ourselves and of course, how we project ourselves in our life. And of course, as I say, a very sort of common interpretation here of the phenomenology would come from going, as I say, to see a doctor or a psychiatrist who will actually say that this is a brain issue. So this is a professional opinion. So I mentioned these sort of, the sources, if you like, would be something I've interpreted myself, something that voices have asserted, or from people around us. Of course, these are sort of cultural beliefs, and a subset of cultural beliefs are professional and peer. So this is a particular one. So this is a professional belief about my brain. And of course, I might, each of us will assess the implications of that differently. Of course, it's the phenomenology here that has shaped this belief. I've sought an opinion because I don't know what it is. And professionals told me that it's my brain that is not behaving in the sort of proper way. And of course, what I will then do is interpret the phenomenon. Some of us, not I will then do, sorry. So some of us then ask the question, well, actually, why is this happening, of course, to me? And of course, a fairly common conclusion people reach is that it's either something that I've done, I've taken drugs in the past, that might, that could be it. I'm lonely, so perhaps I'm creating these things, or something happened to me, I was abused, or something along those lines. So this is, me reaching then a social kind of interpretation based on the phenomenology. But of course, I then kind of say, okay, this changes my concept of who I am, and I start to ask myself, well, what are the implications? And I then start to say, well, okay, as a result of this, what are the things I might consider? So if this is true, then what does this mean for me? So this is just our if-then mind predictive processing, saying the phenomenology, this new thing I'm experiencing, tells me that my brain is dysfunctional or that something happened to me in the past. And I will, I then kind of consider, what does that mean? Because what that does is as I project that into my world, it changes what I act on. And of course, if I'm starting to think of this in terms of other worldly things, it actually changes what I accept, of course, about voices and of course act on. So this is a nice, very simple way. So I don't need to go through each individual will assess the implications differently. I simply want to say that actually you can map this. And what you do is simply follow the line of questions that we ask. And of course, the source, where we're getting information from, and then kind of saying, when you ask yourself, well, how am I interpreting this? And what I want people to do is to kind of say, is to see, how they are limiting themselves and therefore what they do basically. And of course, this is the big problem with this, is we form limiting beliefs. And of course, and this is of course changing, what we think, what we talk about, what we act on, what we believe and what we believe in. And of course, this is our simple cycle of projecting from here to, of course, what we do. So, this simple one, kind of sets the scene for, a more complex one. And of course, let's say, these two, of course, are likely to change my concept of self, of course, and I'm going to project that differently. So this, let's say, is the simple one. So what does a more complex one look like? So this is one where I'm saying, so the previous one was me interpreting this experience of hearing voices in the distance. The second one, I'm saying, okay, here's the same shape, a matrix to think about the phenomenology, as a source of new information, the questions I will actually ask. And of course, what I'm going to do here is say, okay, here's the more complex form of phenomenology. This now, as I say, is, the idea of the sort of thought echo. So I hear voices, my thoughts that are provoked, of course, are half of the conversation. And of course, what's happening now is voices are interfering. my voices are commenting on my every thought. This kind of phenomenology brings my attention very specifically to my thinking. And of course, my thinking shapes everything about me. And of course, voices are commenting on what I'm thinking. And of course, what that does is it changes the shape of these questions a bit. So, whilst I'm asking myself, kind of how is this happening? My voices are telling me, well, actually, you can't understand, and you never will understand. This is literally what my voices sort of tell me. But of course, what they're doing is they're provoking me and trying to get me to think harder and more, of course, by literally engaging my processor in understanding, of course, how this is happening, which gives them more trains of thought with which to interfere and to shape my thinking, and of course, in all sorts of ways. So as I'm trying to figure out what they are, who they are, of course, they are saying, we are this, they're making these assertions, I'm God, I'm the devil. And of course, when I push back on them and tell them, that's not that, that's what actually doesn't matter, we won't tell you. And the reason it isn't mattering, as I say, is because they just kept insisting or persisting with the idea, of what they are. Of course, eventually, years later, they realized that actually I was just rejecting it and rejecting it and rejecting it and saying, don't know what you are, don't care, I don't care what you are. What I'm going to do is own my reaction and my response to you, and you can carry on making all these sort of claims. Of course, so as I'm trying to attribute intent to them, because I'm now, I formed this object, I don't know what it is, and it's behaving very, very badly, bullying me, threatening me, declaring that it can influence my life, all these sort of things. Of course, I'm asking the question why, and of course, at the same time, voices are saying because we can, just like bullies. And they, when I say to them, well, you miserable things, why would you do that? They say, well, actually, we don't care. So I've gone from a why there, so why are you doing this to me? And why are you doing that? So why are you doing this to me? And why are you voices behaving the way you are? So this is because this is very much an interactive relationship, where these voices are displaying intent. So of course, I'm not only, as I'm asking this question, I'm doing these two frames of reference, me and them, and the relationship between us. And all it's doing is, say, it's still these same questions. They just seem a little disguised. And of course, voices are interjecting and intervening and of course, changing. Of course, from this vantage point, they're claiming all this influence life and saying, we will, of course, and you, Gregory, or you, Greggy boy, can't do that. We won't let you do that. So, of course, as I'm, the answers are pushed into the future a lot of the time, and because voices are then kind of making all these assertions, they're interacting as I'm assessing the implications of what they're doing, which is when I'm projecting it forwards, of course. And this is the experience that leads to paranoia and fear. Paranoia and fear are emotions about our security and our inability to act or achieve the outcomes we want in the future. And of course, this is how voices are doing it, just by pushing these questions and answers that we're asking in particular ways. So they're nudging them and they're leading them in particular ways under conditions of distress. So my emotions are typically in sort of threat mode. And of course, what's happening here is now, I'm going to a doctor or psychiatrist who's telling me, these are all hallucinations, or you've got schizophrenia. I'm using a cross here because I'm saying I rejected that as inconsistent with the experience of it. Of course, I rejected the interpretation that my brain was doing this because it was so proactive, so strategic, so tactical, so much information that wasn't in my brain in the first place. So for me, it clearly doesn't come from my brain. So I'm rejecting that. Of course, as I explored the Hearing Voices movement, there were some other ideas coming from peers, and particularly, there's a large group, of course, in the Hearing Voices movement that have experienced past trauma. I haven't, so I was lucky kind of in that sense, but of course, that's not an idea, that I was going to buy into. I also, didn't, for the same reason, buy into the idea. There are lots of professionals that talk about psychosocial factors, so something that's happened in the past. Of course, I had a great life before I started to hear voices, so I rejected that idea. Of course, there's one I'm missing that I should be showing here. It was also the idea that actually it could be a response to an uncaring world. I don't believe that's true either. Of course, it's not something I can act on. I can't suddenly make the world caring. And of course, I was determined to sort of do something about that. So, but of course, I just rejected that idea as well. So what happened with, is the way that my voices responded, of course, is they pushed, the stories that they engaged me with towards conspiracy, which is where they are actually asserting that I am in the middle of a conspiracy, because that's a space where they can actually work with my cognitive bias and my confirmation bias. And of course, they pushed the space, into an other world and introduced the idea of religion. But then again, this, of course, is voices just asserting it. But of course, it's also a culturally supported belief, not necessarily in my own culture, because I'm not a fan of the revealed religions. I see them as a product, of course, of the hearing voices experience. But this is where my voices became, much, much more active. Because I rejected these and was disinclined to believe them, it forced, if you like, voices into these two spaces. And of course, what they did was they then started to declare from here that, of course, when they were talking religion, they had control over sort of our future. When they were talking conspiracy, they had control over my future. Of course, this control over our future changed, my sort of concept of the world. And of course, as they started to talk about me being the second coming, and being their pet project, and then of course doing what they wanted to do one day, and of course what they wanted me to do one day, and of course what they didn't want me to do the next day. They just pushed and pulled, of course exaggerated emotions, and of course this was just them persisting with this idea that they had this say in my life, from this position of power. Of course, as I say, this was this encouragement and discouragement that, designed to sort of change my concept of myself. As I say, it didn't necessarily change my concept of self, but it did certainly push me towards solving much bigger and more complex problems than I might otherwise have tackled, like this stuff, for example. And of course, they had a lot to say about my future. They commented on everything that I did in my day, and they commented on every person that I thought about. So as soon as I think of somebody in my life, of course, voices are commenting on my every thought. So, when I think about this friend or that friend, voices are commenting on it. And of course, in the early days, it was very much a conspiracy in which, I was going to be the victim. And, over the last year or so, it's kind of been the opposite. They've been trying to stoke mania, and by kind of engaging me in this idea, that, this is all going to turn out brilliantly for me and for the world. Whilst that kind of sounds very pleasant, of course, what it's doing is it's distorting my sense of priorities. It's still, whilst I've managed to sort of, control it, it still has an influence on how I think about priorities. I've sort of put a lot of time and effort into this without actually earning any money from it. I should have been doing stuff about earning money a lot sooner, than I have, and of course I just kept seeing that I will achieve good stuff from this, and of course I've persisted with it without making money from it for longer than I should have, and of course that's part of the problem with mania, is you get sort of distracted from what I should have been doing was taking care of myself better down here. Whilst I've been taking care of myself pretty well physically, I haven't been taking care of myself well financially. As I say, it's distorted my my sense of priorities, and of course what I do, and of course voices try very hard to get in the way of how I condition my thinking. So as you would have seen in some of the other videos, I practice neurolinguistic programming, self-directed with myself. It's a way of forming healthy thinking habits. I still manage to do that in my response. But of course, what I actually do live with as what I call pesky facts is that voices still have a presence in my life. I've sort of pushed them into the sort of corners of my life, but I notice that they still steal mind share. It's not problematic from the point of view, that I spend all day on it, but it's an irritation. And although I've automated my response to them, it still irritates me that I have to respond to it, even though I manage the transaction well enough that it's not distressing. It becomes irritating. I detest waking up to them in the morning. Voices tend to interfere a bit at night. You can see them popping up in my dreams in one way or another, or waking up and commenting on my dreams. So I get really irritated with the fact that I wake up to them every morning. I get irritated with the fact that they pester me at night, I get irritated with the fact that they yap at me when I walk the dog, for example. So it's not important, important stuff in and of itself. It's important in the big picture that it actually is a distraction for me, from my quality of life rather than a detraction, if you like. So of course, what happens is I still have this presence. So of course, voice is provoking, and of course, these questions, as I say, become, this kind of stuff shifts because voices are making all these assertions. We can't, because that's the predictive end of our processing. We start to ask these things. Well, is it true? Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? In fact, I did this very, very deliberately. I started asking these questions. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Is it probable? Because that actually was a very deliberate way for me to actually push back against what voices kind of claimed, because they, claiming this stuff and getting an emotional reaction. So of course, what you want to do is be much, much more objective about it. And this was a way for me to maintain objectivity and actually show voices that they had no influence, so that in time they became ridiculous as opposed to threatening. And of course, the trouble is, is what's happening here is as voices are very active over here at the outcome end of our mind processing, it's a space where we are much more reliant on our beliefs and our cognitive bias. And of course, they're able to turn those two against us. Of course, it's shaped, of course, by voice behavior and deception. So here again, although it's the same layout, there's the phenomenology and the implications. Of course, this is much, much more complex. Voices are commenting on everything that you do. What you want to do is identify which of these themes have been most affected by voices. And it's not always direct. So my voices are commenting on everything that I do. So for example, if I go onto an online dating site, or if I go into a bar, for example, I think I might have mentioned in one of my other videos that one of the implications, one of the effects in my life is that I have not put effort into finding a romantic partner. Of course, the activity to do that is either finding someone online or going to a bar or dinners or whatever. But I find the two that are, where I'm alone, if you like, are online and often going into a bar. And of course, that's where voices are very, very busy and sort of commenting on everything that I'm doing. And of course, what that's doing is simply getting in the way of the activity that might lead to me meeting somebody. So that's the idea behind this, is to kind of map activity of voices to activity of mind, and then say, well, what are the implications for me? Where am I forming limiting beliefs? Because that's the piece actually, that is the most insidious about this experience of voices. It's the stuff we stop doing. It's the stuff we stop enjoying that we might otherwise have been doing. And of course, the other thing that happens, is we get encouraged to do all these things that distract us from voices. And that's just, for me, displacement behavior. It might displace voices for a little while, but it doesn't actually build my story. So what we need to do is just use this very simply to get a picture of where are voices having an impact in my life. See that, and then kind of say, well, okay, I can actually do something about it. And actually, I've given voices too much significance, and I've let them steal too much mind share, and I've let them displace too much activity. So significance is this line here, the story, those themes. Mind share, I'm thinking about voices too often, what they're suggesting, what they're inferring, what they're claiming. I'm assessing the implications of it too much. I might be doing too much to guard against what they say. So for example, I installed an extra antivirus software on my PC at one point to cause more problems than it solved. Of course, because the different versions of software just conflicted with each other. And of course, I created more problems rather than solving them. And it took a while for me to recognize that actually all I needed to do was get a maintenance contract from the people I bought the PC from, and actually just use the basic minimum antivirus software. And when I thought I had a problem, was just to walk away from it and come back to it the next day, and the problem was usually gone. But it was just wasteful activity as I was being overcautious. And then of course, as I say, lots of people, it impacts how well they take care of themselves. So I managed to do fine there, but recognize that can be a problem. And then so focus on the activities that you stop doing. or the displacement behavior that's become a habit that actually isn't necessarily building the story. So that's the idea of using this kind of thing, is understand the phenomenology, which is this kind of how and what questions that we're sort of asking. And then, of course, the implications is as we shift to kind of saying, well, why me, and what does it mean for me? And so we can map on these, on this sort of matrix and on the sort of my story model, just to get a sense really of where our beliefs are affecting us and how we behave. Of course, beliefs are strong drivers of behavior. So that's the key thing to learn from it, is, this belief stuff is so complicated. What we have to do is simplify. Of course, there's an unfortunate piece to this for me, is that actually, whilst I say I've pushed voices into the sort of corners of my life, there is still this nagging sense that, gosh, I've made them irrelevant, but actually, and I've automated my response to them, but that in itself irritates me. The fact that I have to irritates me. And of course, it's what I call sort of pesky facts. And I say it's amusing on one hand, but on the other hand, that the trouble with hearing voices is that there is this, you don't achieve the good outcome. There's always this little piece, of sand in there that kind of says this isn't quite the optimum outcome. So for me, it was very obvious that voices damaged my quality of life. I've regained pretty much all of that, except financially. But actually, as I say, intellectually, I know that the outcomes I'm achieving are just that little bit below par. But I say what's interesting about this whole approach, so you would have gathered from some of my other videos that actually, because this is so complicated, I found that actually the best way is to simplify and take a radical rejection of everything about voices. So I recognize the phenomenology. I say, I know it's there. I acknowledge that it's there. And I say, I own my reaction and my response to it. And I dismiss the relationship completely. I've given voices silly, childish names. And of course, that's what I use to respond. And so I just take away their power by doing that. And of course, then in my response, I mock them, I laugh at them, I make it funny, I agree with them. I say, oh yes, of course, that's a marvelous idea. Let's do this. And of course, then say, well, actually, that's not going to work. So I can actually just diminish all the stuff that they're asserting. I can make the transaction pleasant. But I say I'm still mildly irritated by the fact that actually, even though I've automated it, that it's unnecessary. And I say it irritates me in the morning, in the evening, when I'm taking a walk. I have no me time, really. That's the piece that really sort of irritates me. What's interesting, by dismissing the interpretations that sort of voices sought to impose, I've actually reestablished, my, how I satisfy my soothe system. I say, I've taken away all that confusion and simply say, none of what you say makes any sense. It's the only way to do it, because they keep saying things. And even when I've dismissed them, they keep insisting, for example, persisting in the idea that I am the second coming. So you have to keep rejecting it, not just dismissing it, you have to reject it proactively. Because it's engaging your processor all the time, which of course is producing emotions. So instead of, trying to find all sorts of interpretations of what they are, I simply say, we do not know. I acknowledge the presence. I say it's there. I can't walk away. Someday they'll get bored enough and walk away from me. So my monitoring system is no longer seeing this thing as a threat, because I'm in control of it. I'm on top of it. I'm proactive. I'm ahead of them. I disrupt them. I interrupt them. I displace them. I replace them. So even though I can't walk away, I know how to respond. And of course, by this whole thing about getting in the way of what I'm doing, I fix this simply by asserting my rights. I'm saying, I believe in human rights. I have a right to be here. I have a right to respect. And actually, your mere presence disrespects me, so get lost, basically, is what I say. So I object to their presence. But what this is doing is it's giving me true emotions. So my emotions are as near as true as I can get them. So this is the whole point of actually doing all of this, is that unless we do this, actually, we don't record true emotions, which is an important piece, of course, of how we wire the brain. So what we're going to do is recognize that it isn't entirely perfect. I still have slightly suboptimal outcomes intellectually, even though, as you can see, I manage it fine. I'm left with these pesky facts. Number one, I'm aware of this thing. It still has changed my sort of concept of the world to some sort of point, even though I don't make it a problem for myself. and I've made it, you know, non-threatening. The behavior of voices is evil. It's utter out evil. I simply managed to, to learn to respond to it and kind of, and actually completely diminish my emotional reaction to it. But of course, my response to it is, what a waste of time. It's just a waste of time, and I'm responding to it all the time. So I say, even though the behavior is evil, they actually have no power. So the experience of it is this bullying, threatening nonsense. I say that actually all the power they assert they do not have, and I can manage the experience. And that actually, when you understand this, the fact that all this bravado of being evil and acting evil in the absence of any power, and knowing that I can actually manage the experience, it actually makes their presence the most pitiful thing I've ever encountered. So it's this combination of evil and pitiful that I mentioned before in the experience videos. And of course, my soothe system sees this as a nuisance. I'm irritated with the fact, that I say that I'll wake up to voices in the morning and there's nothing I can do about that. I'm irritated with the fact that in the middle of the night, voices will chirp. And of course, that's when I can't be bothered to fight. So I had this debate with myself: do I fight, or do I just try and ignore it and hopefully sort of go to sleep and I chop and change on the night? But of course, I know, of course, that I can own the relationship. I've diminished their power sort of completely, and I see it just as nuisance value. So I have this slight nuisance value, and I call it an S minus. I have this bit of waste, what I call it a D minus, and I have this M minus because I'm aware of this thing, and it's irritating. So and that's what I mean, is that actually, although I do very, very well at conditioning my mind and at creating positive experiences and at creating positive outcomes in life, there is this tiny little bit of nuisance value that's left that I call a pesky fact. But a pesky fact is much less distressful than fear and paranoia and mania, of course. So I hope what you've seen actually from this, of course, you've seen this slide before, is that everything flows, of course, from the phenomenology. So if we understand the phenomenology, if we can recognize the characteristics and features of the phenomenology that we experience, we can then understand how we've shaped that as an object, and of course then how we have actually projected that into implications for our life. And once we understand those two, we can actually minimize the effect on our life by rejecting, obliterating, pushing back against the phenomenology. So thank you for listening. As I mentioned before, I would like to keep as much of this material as possible free for people who hear voices. To do that, I have this fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. So if you can help, please go there and do so. Of course, there are other players in the field also acting off donations that I've also mentioned before. So Intervoice, the policy body of the sort of Hearing Voices movement, spreading training for support group facilitators, Mad in America, changing the conversation, Hearing the Voice at Durham University, doing lots of studies around the stories, particularly of voices, ISPS groups of mental health professionals looking for alternative approaches, and of course the International Consortium on Hallucinations Research, studying the phenomenology. And if you would like together, if you're a researcher, a research group, and would like to work together on developing this matrix framework that I've spoken about, please contact me on please contact me on greg@mad-sense.com. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.